usually start. So thank you very much for coming along this afternoon and welcome to our webinar on Ask a Bug Scientist. And hopefully Kenny and Tanya and I can live up to your expectations this afternoon. We've really enjoyed receiving all of your questions. We've got lots of questions and we've sort of categorized them into different groups. So we'll be able to get to them. So first of all, I'd just like to acknowledge that I am coming to you from the currently sunny, but has been rainy and sunny all afternoon, Blue Mountains, which is Darug country or Gundungurra country, just west of Sydney. And it's my real pleasure to be here as both the Managing Director of Invertebrates Australia and an Associate Professor at Western Sydney University, just down in the Hawkesbury. So I'd like to introduce, or rather ask them to introduce themselves. So we've got Dr. Kenny Wolfe and Associate Professor Tanya Laddie with us. Dr. Kenny, would you like to start off?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Dr. Kenny Wolfe. I currently live down in Tasmania as a contract-based researcher, and my focus is on marine invertebrates, which I love dearly. So I've kind of been part of the Invertebrates Australia team for a few years now as the token marine invertebrate guy.
The head marine invertebrate guy. Thanks, Kenny. And Tanya, would you like to say a few words?
Hi, I'm Tanya Laddie. I am an associate professor at the University of Sydney, and I'm speaking to you from inner West Sydney on Gadigal country. We also are currently having a sunny day, but it was pouring like an hour and a half ago, so we'll see how it goes. And I study mostly flower visiting insects, so pollinators, but also a fairly increasingly broad range of invertebrates, including things like velvet worms. We do a little bit of work on Christmas beetles and other beetles, and a bunch of other things. So I've never met an invertebrate I didn't pretty much love on site. So yeah, it's a lot of things. Very happy to be here.
Thanks, Tanya. Yeah, I guess I should mention what I work on too, which is at the moment bogong moths and other alpine critters that you find down in the snowies. Yeah, lots of fun running around in mountains and figuring out bug mysteries. It's good. So a little bit about Invertebrates Australia, why we exist. So Tanya and I and a colleague, Jess Marsh, 3.5 years ago now, founded Invertebrates Australia because over our careers, it's became more and more obvious that there's this huge gap in conservation in terms of how we look after our invertebrates in Australia. And we wanted to fill that gap by starting a non-profit organisation that relies on donations and members in order to exist, which has the primary function of improving conservation outcomes for our invertebrates. So that's what we're doing, and we want to find out what you want answers to, and we want to help you get those answers today. But also, while we're on the webinar today and while we're thinking about bugs, I'd love it if you could tell us a little bit about what you like from Invertebrates Australia as you learn more about us and more about invertebrate conservation as we go. So how we're going to work this afternoon is we've got all your questions here. Like I said, I've got a second screen here with a spreadsheet all color-coded and ready to go. And we're going to work through sort of how we've categorized them into about 5 different kind of groups of questions, groups of types of topics. We're going to move through those. We may not get to everybody's questions, but we're going to try to answer everyone's questions either directly or indirectly through discussion around the main topics. If you think of a question while we're chatting, you can pop it into the Q&A. So for those of you who don't know where that is, if you go to the bottom of your Zoom window, there's a little square box with a question mark in it and little letters Q&A underneath it. If you click on that, it will open a little box, and there'll be questions that are open, questions that are answers, and questions that we've kind of answered in as we're chatting. We'll tick them off. I see we've got 12 more questions coming in, which is very exciting. We love the enthusiasm. So thank you very much for sending those through as well. All right, I think we can get ready to start. Tanya and Kenny, are you feeling pumped? Are you all ready? Great. So the first sort of type of questions that we want to talk about the answers to today are around actions you can do to help invertebrates, or things you had questions around. What can I do about this or that? And the first, or what should I do? So the first question, actually, I was hoping, Tanya, if you could grab, which is one that is very close to what you're working on right now, which was around whether or not we should leave curl grubs in the soil when we find them in our gardens, and what type of beetles do they become?
That is a fantastic question. So for anyone who's not sure what we mean when we say curl grub, it's usually referring to a fairly large, that big, white to cream colored larvae that you find in the soil. It usually has a distinct head area, which is reddish, brownish kind of color, and 6 little legs kind of sticking out the front end. So almost like a really chunky kind of pale caterpillar in the soil. These are the larvae of scarab beetles, which is a huge group of beetles that includes everything from, dung beetles to Christmas beetles, to many of our flower chafers. So it's a huge group. And one of the things that makes it a little bit tricky is that it's really, really hard to tell the different species apart from the larva. So when you pull a larva out of your garden, you're probably not going to know offhand which of those species it's going to turn into. And so should you leave them? I think a lot of that depends on the context. So if you got them in a pot, with a deeply prized plant that's starting to look a little sickly, it's possible the grubs could be doing that. Some of them are root feeders, although most of the species we've been finding in people's gardens in potted plants are actually flower chafers, which feed on decaying organic matter and only go to the roots, we think, when they run out of that preferred food source. So if you have lots of rich compost and stuff in your pots, they should be fine. If you're worried because the plant is looking like it's sickly and maybe you've ruled out other causes, then you can always just move them to a less valuable part of our garden. You can put them somewhere like in a compost area or, under some other plants where they can kind of go and do their thing. Yeah, so most of the ones we find, at least in Sydney, in potted plants are flower chafers. So things like fiddler beetles, beautiful punctuate flower chafers, these gorgeous insects that are really important for pollination of native plants. So really ask people not to jump to the conclusion that you necessarily have one of the pest species. They exist, but they tend to prefer turf grass in our experience and not so much in garden soil and other places. So if you're worried, just move them somewhere else and let them go on and do their thing, because they're pollinators. They're important for recycling soil into the moving soil around, and they're important food for lots of other animals.
So good. So hopefully we get the curl grubs out of the way nice and early and everyone knows what to do. Do get that question a lot, and it's a great question. So in our sort of actions questions, Kenny and Tanya, you guys have had a look at these as well. Is there something you want to jump in and have a chat about? I can go for another question while you're having a look, which is what priority invertebrate community science projects are there? There are a lot. Of course, we're going to say that the ones that Invertebrates Australia are running are high priority. We wouldn't be doing them if we didn't think they were high priority. But on our website, we do have a list of a whole lot of invertebrate community science projects that are happening. So I'll pop that link in the chat now, and I'll hand over to Kenny or Tanya if you guys have to grab a question.
Yeah, I guess that feeds really well into the question, are there any good news stories about pollinators and what actions might be most helpful to them? Because Invertebrates Australia has been running a no spray spring campaign for a few years now that's quite successful and quite close to a lot of our hearts, keeping our pollinators safe in our environments and in our backyards as well, in urban environments. Do you want to talk a little bit to that as well, Tanya?
Oh, yeah, sure. So let's see, good news stories. This is a tricky one because I think we hear a lot of doom and gloom about like all the bees are dying and the bee apocalypse and so on. And in Australia in particular, it's a really nuanced question because, first of all, when we talk about native pollinators and insects that require conservation initiatives, we're actually not talking about what most people think of first, which is the European honeybee. Your orange and black kind of stripy bee that is sort of emblematic of bees is not actually in conservation trouble. It's a managed species, much like chickens. It's important for our agriculture, but it's being looked after. These aren't the ones we worry about. What we worry about is that huge group of native pollinators, which isn't even just native bees, of which we have more than 2,000 different species of native bee in Australia, but it's also things like our flies and our butterflies, our moths, lots and lots of other critters. And we don't know for most of these if there are good news stories because we are not tracking their populations. So we don't know if they're going up or down. We're not sure what's happening with many of them. For me, what I think of that's encouraging for me is I work a lot in urban spaces. And what we find is that even in the inner city, you get lots of native bees. In fact, the diversity in the inner city can sometimes be as high as in those suburbs that are adjoining bushland. And so what I always tell people is that any patch of land anywhere can become a haven for pollinating insects if you plant the right things. And you can see changes really quickly. You put in a good mix of the right flowers, and often, within weeks, you'll have bees moving in, you'll have flies coming in. And that kind of feeds into the question about how do you encourage good insects. I think planting flowers is probably one of the best things you can do. There are lots of lists online, like the Ween Bee, a powerful pollinator guide that has lists of flowers you can plant that are attractive to insects. And it's not just pollinators, it's also all those insects that do pest control, like your ladybirds, your lacewings, even spiders do better if they have access to nectar, because nectar is this sort of sugary power punch they can get a lot of energy from, and pollen is extra protein. So planting those flowers is a huge step towards that. And then, of course, trying to minimize and preferably eliminate the use of insecticides in your gardens, because most of us probably don't need to be using insecticides in our household gardens.
Yeah, that's great. So, and I think it kind of ties in perfectly to the last question that we have in this category, which is around the best methods to survey invertebrates. And that kind of links both to what we're talking about with pollinators, but also talking about community science programs or citizen science programs. So like one of the best ways is honestly to just go and look at flowers and see what's there, and do it, a lot, because it's amazing how much you get to know, how quickly you get to know the critters that live in your back garden, your front garden, your local bush track, the nature strip outside your bus stop, or whatever the case may be, if you just have a look regularly. And that's, that seems kind of silly and obvious, but actually it's one of the most powerful ways to learn about what invertebrates are around. If you want to record that information though, photos are great, photos are fantastic. Most of us have some pretty fancy cameras in our iPhones these days, or our smartphones. But really any camera will do a pretty good job at capturing at least some of these critters. So those, and then submitting them to something like iNaturalist, which we love and we use a lot at Invertebrates Australia, we highly recommend as an incredibly important tool, and all of us use it all the time. Pretty well all of us do, to identify things and to record what we've seen. So iNaturalist is a non-profit organization based in the US, and they are probably suffering quite heavily at the moment under the current administration, and can deal with some serious support from around the world. They are an incredibly great organization, and an incredibly stable organization. What we've seen with kind of these sorts of photo recording programs is that they sometimes come and go quite a lot, or the data that are contained in ones that only have very short lives tend to get lost to the system, which is a real shame. But iNaturalist seems to be the one that's emerged that's going to have a long life, which is really exciting. There are alternatives for some community science programs as well for uploading photos of things. Some like Moth Tracker, for example, by Zoos Victoria for bogong moths, has its own website through Federation University in Victoria, and so on. So there's all kinds of different ways that people are, you can, provide your observations. But that is a really relatively simple and enjoyable way to survey insects and invertebrates in general. Of course, underwater photography gets a little bit more challenging, especially if things are a little deep and things like that. So rock pools, maybe not so hard, Kenny, but you don't really want to drop your smartphone in a rock pool too many times, I would guess. What's the story with our marine friends?
Yeah, it's a tricky space to work in sometimes. Invertebrates in the ocean are often quite cryptic, hiding away from the bigger fish and predators that would eat them. Tide pools are a great example of being able to go along the rocky shoreline or even along beaches, kind of finding different species as you would going along those habitats. And then you've really got to get your feet wet and jump in the water with a mask and snorkel and an underwater camera. So that, yeah, starts to escalate quickly into a passion and a skill set.
Yeah, but so much you can do from, I mean, one of the biggest contributors to iNaturalist in from Australia, his little code name on iNaturalist is the beachcomber, right? Just going along. And the cool thing about marine invertebrates is that the diversity is bonkers. Like, we've got a lot of diversity on land, you know, and hundreds of thousands of insect species. But when you go into the ocean, that's where everything evolved. So it's like not just hundreds of thousands of species, it's like all the different major groups of animals are right there. Like even on somewhere like Long Reef Rock Platform in the northern beaches of Sydney, you might find like 7 different major groups of animals. Like it's absolutely amazing. So totally
Yeah.
worth it. Get
And
wet.
a great way to find them too, like you said, beach combing. You often find everyone's walked along the beach and picked up a shell. There's lots of different organisms that leave shells and skeletons behind that give you an indication of the species being in the water without actually jumping in yourself.
Yeah. But beyond photos, you know, like a butterfly net sweeping along with along grasses to see what, you know, falls into your net is a really simple piece of kit that can tell you a lot about the insects in an area. A light trap, or even just using like your porch light, switching it on, putting like a white bed sheet, not your mum's best one, because it's probably going to get a little bit of moth poo on it or something like that. Like she's, it's not going to be extreme, but you know, you don't want to get the nicest, cleanest, whitest sheets out of the cupboard. And yeah, just popping that near your porch light and seeing what arrives at night, those sorts of really simple things can tell you a lot. You know, you don't need really high-tech, expensive equipment to find out a lot about what's going on around your home and wherever else you want to find out about. But of course, be careful. There's some places where you will need permits and things like that. And you certainly don't want to be taking invertebrates out of the wild, in particular marine reserves, national parks, all those sorts of places. But certainly just to figure out what you've got and have a good look at it. Fantastic. All right. So moving on to our group of questions that I've kind of labeled the functions of invertebrates. We've got a couple here. I think maybe a good one might be to start with you, Kenny, talking a little bit about macroinvertebrates and water quality. It's a good one for people to jump into.
Yeah, and it kind of flows onto these survey.
Not literally, but you could jump in.
Yeah, sticking to the wet marine environments.
Yes.
Someone asked on the presence of macroinvertebrates and water quality, and this does tie back to the question on Beth's survey methods, because invertebrates provide a great indicator of water quality. Some species have particularly high tolerance thresholds to different stress levels, and other species are quite vulnerable and susceptible to even the slightest change. So getting an understanding of the species composition in habitats is a great indicator of the quality of that habitat. And so some examples of this for resilient species, you might see your diversity levels decrease, but you'll actually see quite an abundance of resilient snails or maybe worms in these aquatic habitats. Even things like when you stumble across this really stagnant cesspool pond sitting in the corner of the world somewhere that's full of mosquito larvae, there are species that are very resilient to those conditions. But then if you've got kind of that awesome, natural, clean condition state in your river system, that's when you'll see the high diversity, which is what we want to support in our ecosystems, because high diversity means ecosystem functioning and a healthy ecosystem.
Yeah, awesome. And it means less mozzies and stuff like that, right? It does
Exactly.
mean that those sorts of we will admit there may be 1 or 2 invertebrates that are a little bit less than perfect, let's say. And that we might not want thousands of them around us at all time. And mosquitoes do tend to fall into that trap, into that category. And of course, for all of your kind of mosquito health related news, you should definitely be following Cameron Webb on social media, who does lots of information around mosquitoes and health, with Japanese encephalitis and you know, really troublesome diseases like that popping up recently. But yeah, so what Kenny's saying, of course, is, you know, keeping all those waterways healthy is a great way to control those problematic things too. I thought this was a really interesting question around the insect farming. So it's slightly off topic for Invertebrates Australia, because of course we're focused on insect conservation, but being focused on insect conservation means that, of course, what we're really thinking about is looking after biodiversity more broadly and trying to represent invertebrates in that kind of space. And one of the things we can do to protect biodiversity globally is to move away from especially in Australia, meat eating and things like that, and move into more sustainable areas of protein consumption. And one of those is invertebrates. And of course, we'd like to see very ethical practices around farming invertebrates and things like that popping up. And the question is just around what species do we think will be farmed for protein in Australia? And this is definitely not my area of expertise at all, but I'm aware of black soldier flies being raised for protein, not so much for people, if I understand correctly, but more for feeding animals that are in agricultural systems. But maybe we could talk, maybe you guys know a little bit more about that than I.
Yeah, I can talk about that a little because we've done some work in my lab on black soldier fly and other soldier fly species, and we visited a few of the production facilities in Australia. And I think you're right, Kate. Black soldier fly is probably the front runner at the moment, partly because it's relatively easy to breed in large numbers. It loves to eat kind of decaying organic matter, so that's stuff like food scraps, which is really important, because you can get these beautiful circular economies going where, farm waste get fed to the soldier flies who convert that into useful protein, which can then go back to livestock food and potentially even human food. There are some barriers, I think, to the eating insect protein as humans, and largely those are just kind of working through some of the legislation around eating insects, but also kind of working through, if we feed them food scraps, are they still, safe for humans to consume? And those are things that people are actively working on. The other big groups for potential protein would be crickets, again, because they're easy to produce in large numbers. You can feed them waste streams typically, and they'll be able to produce nice, high quality protein. And cockroaches, probably less so for human consumption, but that's largely because of our particular biases, I suspect, against eating cockroaches. But I mean, for anyone interested, there's some really cool developments all over Australia right now with people using insects both for breaking down waste, but also for creating protein and doing that together. And that's really, really interesting. So keep an eye out. I think there's going to be a lot of development in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Tanya. What other questions took your fancy in this function section?
I liked the locust question. I can have a crack at that.
Oh, yeah, and I was thinking I might have a little crack at it too. So you go ahead, and then if you answer it enough, then I can quietly slip into the background on that one. But I'm supposed to know a couple of things about grasshoppers, so we'll see.
Yeah.
Tanya.
Yes. So the question is, what makes locusts so effective at being a pest? Which is really, first of all, it's interesting because, of course, there are lots of different types of locusts, and not all of them necessarily cause problems all of the time. But the species that usually are an agricultural pest have this really interesting system where most of the time they're solitary individuals kind of living their independent lives, eating, and they might cause a little bit of damage, but not reaching those kind of locust plague sort of situations. But then under certain conditions, they switch, particularly when they start to get crowded, they kind of switch into a different phase of their lives, I suppose, just called the gregarious form. And the gregarious ones, they like to be in groups. They form these huge marching bands of locusts. And we're talking billions and billions of locust swarms. They'll just march across countries, kind of eating any vegetation almost that they get their little mandibles on. And that's when we start to run into problems, because I mean, if you've ever seen videos of these swarms, it is incredible. Just the sheer numbers of locusts that can move, and then they'll also be migrating, and so flying in these big waves where it's just like sky darkening numbers of locusts. So it's really one of the reasons they can become an issue is because of that gregarious phase and switching into that very swarm behavior, which can cause problems.
Yes. I was thinking about that too, and how they have their complete color change and physiological change and everything that completely changes when they're in their solitarious to gregarious form. And yeah, they have this whole big thing of like tolerating more individuals around them. It's a complete switch. It's totally amazing. Yeah, boom and bust kind of life cycles. Great. All right. I did also want to just briefly say that the person who has a potter wasp next to their front door, that's fine. That's okay. They're very, very unlikely to harm humans. And they make these cool little ceramic-y type, things. Just enjoy having a cool little critter next to your door. And yeah, maybe just stay a meter away or something like that. But yeah. All right. So now we're on to a rather large chunk of questions, which is all around identification and natural history questions of different groups of invertebrates. And it was super fun to see just how many kind of basic natural history questions people have, or fundamental natural history questions people had about different groups of animals. Because this is where we really, we could talk about this for, I don't know, collectively, possibly years on end, right? Just so much fun. And this is, I guess, why a lot of us got into invertebrates in the first place, because they're just so weird and cool and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. So, gosh, there's so many good ones, and so many really challenging ones. And we'll surprise nobody to find out that the most challenging one came from our kind of under 12 age group, that ones around. And so maybe we should start with some of those, and we can kind of try to stumble through them in a kind of embarrassing way to amuse the, see if we can get anything. So one of the ones I've been thinking about since I saw it, and I'm still not sure if I'm confident with my answer, is the question of why are snails so slow? I thought this was a fantastic question. And I think the answer is because they've never been able to be fast. And that sounds like a bit of a cheating answer, but let me explain. So snails evolved in the ocean with all of their other mollusk relatives, so the clams and also the octopuses and things, which can move fast. And snails, slide along on a mucus trail that they have to create, and that's quite slow to kind of emit mucus and then slide along on it. So first of all, that's kind of quite a slow thing to do. And they're kind of limited by the fact that they've got one big foot that's sort of got tricky musculature, and it relies on this mucus trail. But also their vision is really quite rudimentary. And what we see in the evolution of animals is that animals that move fast also typically have sensory equipment that can send really detailed information really quickly to the brain. And so there's something about snails kind of having rudimentary vision and this kind of slow mucus-dependent movement that keeps them slow. But what's quite cool is that their relatives, like the octopuses and squids, like giant squids, colossal squids, the biggest insects ever, the biggest invertebrates, oh my goodness, the biggest invertebrates ever, the colossal squid, they're so fast. But they had to invent something called jet propulsion in order to be able to move quickly. And what's cool is they also have these amazing, huge, and very complex eyes. So it sort of fits this question, this sort of hypothesis, I guess, that I've started to develop around sensory equipment and the speed that you're moving through the environment. So it was a really fun one to talk about. We actually debated it at the dinner table last night because it was so much fun to think about, because I have a snail specialist staying with me. So it's very exciting. Yeah, Kenny or Tanya, do you want to jump in?
Sure. I think that's a great answer, really.
Yes.
I think the only thing I'd add is that as slow as they're going, it costs a huge amount of energy for snails to move relative to other animals. So more than almost any other terrestrial land-dwelling animal. And that's because they're producing all of this mucus and they've got to move their bulk. And so you can imagine if they were trying to move fast, that even more increases the amount of energy, which means they have to eat more, which starts to become really difficult. So it may very well be like a slow and steady, slow lifestyle suits them better because it's just so energetically expensive for them to walk around or splooge around.
Awesome. Kenny, do you want to jump in with a question from the giant list of natural history questions that we've got? Do you want to pick some and go for it?
Yeah, I'm happy to pick one, and no surprises that it might be a marine related one.
Yeah.
But someone asked, can crabs breathe underwater and in air? And the
Nice.
answer is yes. It's very exciting, and it's quite a remarkable trait to be able to do both. And differs to fish because crabs have gills, but they're specialized gills, and they are adapted to breathe in water, but can also leave the water. And some species in particular, like hermit crabs that you might almost entirely see on land rather than in water, have specialized gills that can, as long as the gills stay wet, they can also take up oxygen from the air as well. So they're susceptible to dry out, which is why you won't find a crab in a desert. But they, yeah, can breathe in both water and air.
That's a ripper.
There was
What
also
about
another one that I liked to do with the color of invertebrates, if we're allowed to jump to that one, about any
Oh,
pink colored invertebrates.
yeah, that was a great question. I actually I got a Google image search up. And I don't know, it's hard to say. Yeah, I can share my screen, but I'll also just put the link in. It's hard to say which is the best pink invertebrate, but there are, so some grasshoppers every now and again have a pink form. So there's like a genetic kind of predisposition in a lot of orthopterans, so that's the grasshoppers and the katydids and things, to every now and then show up a bright pink version of a normally green animal, which is fantastic, of course. But there's also, well, famously in our circles anyways, the Mount Capita pink slug, which is the greatest of all, well, the greatest of all slugs on Mount Capita, probably. It's a very cool slug. It's completely hot pink. It's fantastic. And it's related to the lipstick slugs or the red triangle slugs that people see around, I think at least the southeast. I'm not sure exactly what their distribution is, but the southeast of Australia. But I've chucked a giant link in the chat where I just Googled pink invertebrate in Australia. And you can see there's like heaps of cool things with pink or pink on them. Yeah.
Lots of marine examples, which I really like as well. Lots of nudibranchs and corals and anemones and jellyfish, and probably one of the hottest topic species at the moment, particularly for New South Wales, is the endangered cauliflower soft coral, which
Yes.
is beautiful. It literally looks like a piece of cauliflower attached to the sea floor, but is pink in color, not just white.
So cool. And so they look a little bit like a cauliflower. Do they feel like cauliflower or do they feel
I've
just
not touched one, but I think they're a bit softer. Maybe
yeah.
if you cook the cauliflower for a bit too long.
The way I always do it. Tanya, what have you got on your mind that you'd like to talk about?
See here. There was, where is, just looking through the list. There was a question about how long Australia's green carpenter bees live, which I thought was
Oh,
is a good question. Because when we
yeah.
think about how long insects live, it can be a little tricky because they have different parts of their life cycles. So the big buzzy green carpenter bee that you see flying around, that's the adult phase, but that's often a lot shorter than the amount of time they spend as a larvae or a baby. So they're
Right.
kind of like caterpillars, and then you get egg, you get a larva phase, and then that goes into a pupa and turns into soup, reforms into this beautiful adult that then comes out. So for carpenter bees, the whole life cycle from when they're born to when they die as adults is probably around about a year. I think this actually links to another question further down where someone asked about what invertebrates are doing over the cold months.
Yeah.
And, that depends totally on the species. It's very different for different critters, but for things like green carpenter bees and many of our native bees, they will lay their eggs kind of throughout the summer, the spring, summer, and then as autumn comes, they kind of finish up with their nests. The adults die and the larvae are growing in the nests, wherever those might be. And then pupating and then coming back out in the springtime. So about a year total, but as an adult, it's probably only a few months.
Yeah, nice. I was just looking at the queen spider question, and I think it's a cool question because although there definitely is not a queen spider in the way that you think about like a queen bee, or like that movie with Jackie Chan, the Tuxedo. That was like there was like a, or was that a queen water strider? Anyway, it was a little bit out there. They're not social. But spiders, to quickly hit on another question, they are all venomous. They're just not all, their venom doesn't all work on us. So they do all have venom, but they're not dangerous to us. So that's an important kind of distinction there. But the queen spider question is cool because initially you might think, no, that's silly. They don't have queens, but actually there's some really cool social huntsmen and other groups of spiders that work together in groups, and where the babies stay with the mom and they all hunt together and things like that in little tiny balls of eucalyptus leaves that are kind of stitched together with beautiful silk, like as if it was from a May Gibbs illustration, these gorgeous, beautiful little things. And they're tiny, tiny, tiny. They all hang out together. So they do have levels of sociality or group living that you may not expect, which is quite neat. Have you got other examples of that, Tanya?
No, I was just going to say that there are those groups of social spiders, which are fascinating, like the social
Yeah.
huntsmen that live collectively under bark, and a few other groups that kind of, they're not as social, they're at a different level of sociality than things like honeybees or ant colonies, where you have, some individuals that reproduce and some that do other jobs. Although allegedly there's one species of potentially social spider that does have that reproductive division of labor where, but then it seemed like people are still trying to research the details of those. So there are
Mhm.
definitely social spiders. Also, fun fact that I only learned a few weeks ago, there's one family of venomless spiders, the
Oh,
Eulaboridae, that don't have venom, and they rely on just like wrapping things up really quickly and using liquefying enzymes to kill, but it's
excellent.
not technically venom,
Is
which,
that because it's not injected? Is that why it's not venom, or why do they say
no,
that?
they don't have venom glands. So yeah,
Oh,
they're
great.
kind of regurgitating, I assume, stomach-y stuff, although my spider physiology is pretty much that's it. I
Excellent.
don't really know if that's how it
Always an
is.
exception.
Always an exception.
Always.
Just like
And there's
there's
a
even a
vegetarian
vegetarian
spider.
spider.
Jinx.
Nice. Yeah, nature loves exceptions.
Yeah, nature loves except well, humans like to try to force categories, one or the other.
Yeah.
Um, that reminds me of a question, Kenny, about starfish. Did you want to jump on that one? Or sea star? Oh, wait a minute, you're on mute. Sea stars, rather.
Sorry, everyone. I'm answering the live chats while we're
Oh,
on
thank you.
terrestrial questions. So I put on mute so you can't just
Thanks for saying,
thinking
I don't know, I
on
don't
my
know, I
keys.
don't know.
But someone asked, are starfish poisonous? And it raises a really interesting kind of topic on the difference between being poisonous or venomous. And poisonous is being toxic to eat, whereas venomous is something that sends a toxin your way directly. And so most starfish are not poisonous, but some can be venomous. So the crown of thorns starfish is, as the name suggests, very prickly, like a crown of thorns. And each of those spikes, much like a individual butt of a bee, has a little stinger with venom inside. So stepping on a crown of thorns can be quite painful, much worse than a bee, because there are hundreds, if not thousands, of thorns per starfish. And lots of starfish also have an internal body chemistry that's not really favorable to be consumed. So that's why lots of starfish are kind of sitting on a rock pretty and happily safe from being eaten by a predator, because their internal body chemistry does have some kind of toxicity to it.
So cool.
I love starfish.
And how do you feel about the sea star starfish thing? Nobody cares.
Oh,
They're all
look,
cool.
technically these days sea star, but in the grand scheme of things, starfish is what people relate to. And there was another question about what is the rarest kind of starfish. So just while we're on the topic of starfish, maybe I'll address that one.
Go for
And
it.
in Australia, at least, that's kind of where we are. So we'll stick to that. The Derwent River sea star down in Tasmania, kind of in the Derwent River around Hobart, has not been found since 1993 or before 1993. The last surveys that have been done since then have not reported any of the sea star in its usual habitat. It's not to say it's not out there, but it is trending towards extinction, or at least now thought to be likely extinct.
What are we gonna do, Kenny? What are we gonna do?
Well, we need some people out there surveying. Hopefully, we can find it, and also
Cool.
kind of lobbying against the main threats down here. So in the Derwent River around Hobart and surrounds that intertidal area is where a lot of development occurs. And going back to that water quality issue, a lot of contaminants from things like the salmon farming industry, even in the seas down here.
We've seen a lot of that in the news over the last week or so. Okay, so
Yeah.
what can people do? They write to their ministers and talk to their friends and yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
be vocal,
Maybe
be active.
maybe avoid some buying farmed fish.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Kenny. That's great. I'm also trying to answer questions on the Q&A, and I'm finding that I'm getting myself caught in the weeds in like evolutionary biology. So sorry, everyone. I'm trying to answer things as quickly as possible, but I'm writing essays. All right, so we have 20 minutes left in our webinar. So I think maybe what we'll do is we'll move on to, unless anyone wants to grab any more of those natural history questions before we move on to the next category. Go, Tanya. Yeah, you're dying to answer one.
Well, there was just a great one about why are flies different sizes that I think I
Yeah,
can
go for
answer
it.
very quickly, which is that
Yeah,
there are a
do it.
lot of different species of flies. Like there are more than 150,000 described species of flies, and the actual number is probably like twice that. So you have flies that are smaller than 0.5 millimeter. The world's smallest fly is a type of a phorid fly, which is half a millimeter. And you get some that have wingspans of up to 10 centimeters in our world's largest fly. So huge, 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 like enormous. It's in South America. I would love to see it one day, but yeah, so huge ranges. And mostly when you see flies that are very different sizes, it's probably because they're different species. But of course, within a species, they can vary in size as well, depending often on what they ate when they were little. If they were babies that had lots and lots of food, you tend to get larger adults than if they only had a little.
It reminds me of, I was watching Life in the Undergrowth again last night for the millionth time, obviously. And it reminds me of the scene where David Attenborough is sitting in front of the fossil dragonfly wing and it's like 30 centimeters long. It's so cool. Yes, awesome. Thanks, guys. Actually, I do want to talk about the squid ink one just because it was such a cool question. I mean, we don't really know the full answer, but there was a question around how do squids make ink? And of course, they have their own little gland. There's the squid ink gland. That it's basically like melanin and mucus together, right, Kenny? It's like basically just like brown snot.
Yeah, it's like a squid making boogers.
So good.
In a specialized sac that they make with a specialized gland, and yeah, they use the kind of melanin pigment, so the black pigment, and that's put with their boogers or their mucus, and that's what ink is. Yeah,
so good. I mean, my kids make that every time they go into the garden. They come in, blow their nose, and yeah, it's all
yeah.
good.
Well, people put squid ink on their pastas and things in
True.
fancy restaurants, and so it's just squid boogers.
Man, hilarious. All those fancy people out there. Stay fancy, but just remember it's boogers. Excellent. All right. So there was one question that we may have already covered, but I think it might be worthwhile just revisiting a little bit, which is around how to improve the likelihood that macro photos will be identifiable on iNaturalist. One of the reasons I wanted to highlight this question is because we're going to have a webinar on that coming up with two of Australia's absolutely amazing macro photographers, macro cinematographers, Alan Henderson, who's based in Kuranda, and it runs Mini Beast Wildlife, among many other things, and Romilly Spears, who's a macro cinematographer who's Australian but based in Bristol, which is like the Hollywood of nature documentaries that most people will be aware of. She's currently in Australia filming some cool critters down in the Snowy Mountains. And they're going to give a whole webinar on that topic. So do come along. You need to sign up as a supporter to be to join that webinar. But it'll be absolutely worth it because they're absolutely top of their field. But yeah, Kenny and Tanya, do you have any sort of top tips, especially marine type tips? And also, Tanya, you're doing a lot of fast flying buzzy things that might be hard to capture. I tend to work on slow, easy to catch things.
For the fast things, patience. It's mostly patience. Figure out what they want and sit by whatever they want for a long time. So for most of the flower visiting things like mini bees, I'll park myself in front of a patch of flowers where I see them visiting, and I'll just sit there with my phone, just waiting to take a picture. I think if you can, clip-on macro lenses have come down in cost. I don't actually have mine on me at the moment, but these are ones that just clip onto your camera. They range in cost from the more expensive ones to the cheaper ones. I can put recommendations in the chat if anybody's interested in the type that I use. But they can make a big difference in allowing you to be able to focus much more closely on your subjects so that you can get a better picture. A tip I picked up actually doing a very similar to workshop to I think the one that we're going to be having is to have light with you. So now I carry a little pocket flashlight with me, just a small one that I got for not that much money. And so I can put that and use that to kind of adjust the lighting when I'm taking pictures. I do all of mine with just my phone and my macro lens that clips onto the phone. So nothing fancy. The whole setup, is not as expensive as getting a big heavy macro lens. I just have it on me all the time because once you start looking, you never know when you're going to see something really cool, like on your walking to work or just walking in your backyard or whatever. Having stuff with you all the time means you can snap those pictures wherever you are, which I think is great. For identification, it's really important to get a couple of different angles. So typically we want at least the top, the front, if you can get a face picture, the rear, and then the underside, especially for a lot of species, will capture most of the features. Don't be afraid of taking, like, my camera roll is just like 20 pictures of the same insect sometimes. And that's fine. You can always sort through them later, and it just increases the chance that that feature that a specialist might need will be on it. So things like wing venation are often important, and you may capture it in one photo and not the other. So lots of pictures, patience, and light. I think are the big ones.
Yeah, and with the light, I got a really good tip from Alan when we were out in the forest together, that if you put just like some greaseproof paper or something over it, then it stops it from being too shiny in one spot and diffuses it a bit. But Kenny, when you're in the ocean, it's a whole other thing, right?
Yeah, the ocean, I mean, it's a refraction of light underwater. It changes everything. And it's the same kind of situation, though, where if you have a light source, then you don't have to rely on whether it's cloudy. And so, 10 meters underwater, that might change things. So a light source is really good, and multiple photos to make sure that you get different angles and different perspectives, and at least one in focus if you're me trying to take photos. One might be good if you take lots. And if you can, try and get a scale as well. And I know it's tricky with invertebrates that are coming and going. For me, some of my favorite organisms barely move, like starfish and sea cucumbers. They're pretty stationary, and I still somehow get it wrong. But as a scale on some of these species, so that you know the size of what you're dealing with as well, because that can be a big indicator of species in their habitats.
Yeah, I also thought with marine stuff, getting down and getting the photos sideways rather than from directly
From
above.
above, yeah.
Better in terms of backscatter, is that?
Yeah, that definitely, and it also provides a lot of kind of the habitat perspective at the same time. But yeah, doing that especially earlier in the morning and later in the afternoon, so just before shark dusk and dawn, and taking photos at that angle so that the light is less of an issue. Yeah.
All right, well, in our last 10 minutes, we got quite a few questions about entomology careers and invertebrate careers. And so that's something that we'd be really happy to talk about now. And also, if folks are interested in talking to us in the future as well, we plan to have career advice and workshops and seminars and things like that coming up. And so in this section, we received questions along the lines of, how do you become a bug scientist? What do you love about your job? Is it hard to get into entomology as a career? How do you get into invertebrate conservation? What university courses would you recommend? I'm a bug and a science enthusiast, and I must know, which I loved. That's a great question. Who'd like to start off? Tanya, do you want to have a crack at that one to start with?
Sure. So that's a bunch of questions all at once. I guess as far as how do you become an entomologist, I think that's a really good one, and one I think we all get a lot, because it's not as clear as becoming, say, a lawyer or a vet, where there's like, you go to vet school to become a vet. There's no entomology school anywhere in Ontario, in Australia.
You've lived in Sydney for 20 years, but that's fine.
I know. I flashed back to home for some reason. Really anywhere, most places in the world don't have universities that have an entomology department. So instead, what we do typically is specialize in some field related to biology. So some people will come through something called zoology, others will come through ecology, biology, agriculture. Because entomology is about what we study, but we all study those insects in different ways, and that's usually where our background is. So for myself, my undergraduate degree in university was in biology and environmental science, and then my PhD is in insect ecology. So I'm interested in the interactions of insects in their environment and with people. Whereas I have colleagues that came through genetics or molecular biology, and then they work on insects in those contexts, or people who took evolutionary biology and use insects as their models, or marine sciences, or lots and lots and lots of different avenues. So I think if you're thinking about, the good news is if you're thinking about studying entomology at a university, is you can really take anything almost within biology or agriculture or marine sciences. And most universities, I think, have at least one entomology unit of study. At Sydney Uni, which is where I work, so I know what we have. We have two entomology units. One's like an intro to entomology, and the other is more of an applied entomology. And different universities will have those as different versions of that as well. So it's really picking those units of study to kind of get interested, talk to researchers. We all love to chat about what we study. So, if you're at uni and you have a researcher that is interested in something that you find fun, just ask them about their research. We will talk for hours. So many hours, and we're always more than happy to kind of give tips and talk about how we got to be where we are. So lots of options. As far as jobs and how hard it is to get into entomology, again, that's really hard because it depends what you're talking about. Are we talking about an academic job? So my job is an academic job. But there's also some of my students have gone on to work in government, doing conservation stuff. Some have gone to work in the agricultural sector, doing consulting. So there's lots of possible avenues. And what I tell students who are kind of nervous about, like, if I do a lot of entomology, am I going to have a hard time finding a job? The answer I say is that you will get the skills to do a broad number of jobs if you go through that kind of course, because you're never going to be specializing just in insects. You're also going to learn about how to analyze data. You're going to learn basic experimental design. You're going to learn how to talk to people. You're going to learn how to do presentations. You're going to learn how to write. So and whilst getting an entomology specific job it can be, depending on where you want to go, sometimes easy, sometimes hard. Even with those skills, you can apply them to so many different places that you won't get locked into necessarily only being able to apply for entomology positions.
Yeah, great. And what about you, Kenny? What's so marine invertebrates, like, and often I've heard you use the phrase non-coral marine invertebrates, which gets really
Well,
complicated.
yeah, that's it. I guess what Tanya said is really spot on. So I'm a bit of an anomaly in that scene where you say you're a marine biologist and people think you study whales or dolphins, and you say, no, I work on, marine invertebrates, and people think, well, you work on the coral reef, then you focus on corals. I'm like, no, yet again, something else. And my PhD, I came from the evolutionary developmental biology side of things. So my PhD is in anatomy and histology, like a completely different. I'm never got a certificate through my undergrad or post undergrad research that said marine science anywhere. And I've worked in academia for 10 years and now moved to Tasmania and am trying to be an independent researcher. And what's keeping me tied to invertebrates is my passion for invertebrates. And I can apply my skill set and my drive to study these things no matter where I am. And by joining the Invertebrates Australia team and joining on projects within that scene as well. So there's lots of avenues you can take, and it's really about your interests and what you really want to achieve in that study.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think, yeah, I mean, I think the key thing is probably just getting contact with people. Like it might seem quite daunting to email a university lecturer or something like that, like myself or Tanya. And we may be slow at getting back to you, particularly if it's teaching semester and things like that. But we're always very happy to help, because we're aware that it's not straightforward and it's not always clear, and it's absolutely fine. In fact, encouraged to get in contact with academics, to get in contact with us at IA, to get in contact with the people that you think that you would like to become, right? Because they know how to do that because they're that. So that's a good way to start, including people like cinematographers and zookeepers and all those sorts of things. One of the reasons we started IA is because we wanted to provide, hopefully, we want to be able to provide people with a career pathway into invertebrate conservation. We want to be able to have a place for people that are passionate advocates for invertebrate conservation, to work together. And we are open to volunteers, and we're open to, occasionally we have paid positions, but we're very small and very new. But we are certainly open to volunteers, and we're developing more school programs and things like that at the moment. So we're hoping to be able to offer more pathways in the future. And so speaking of which, if your school is keen on getting into invertebrate conservation, we've partnered recently with a company called Aludo, which makes computer games for education and evolutionary biology and conservation biology, to create an invertebrate conservation challenge. And that's pitched at sort of years three and above in primary school, and it's free for teachers to sign up. So if it's interesting, the Aludo, I'll just pop that in the chat, aludo.com is the name of the company that we've partnered with, and they're based here in Sydney, and they are creating all these really cool free resources for teachers to use. So you can jump in and join. There's already 60 teachers from around the country that have signed up, so get on in. Like I mentioned before, there's opportunities to learn more about macro photography and macro cinematography coming up in our next webinar, which you need to be a supporter or a member to be at, and we'd love for you to join up. Becoming a supporter is $50 a year, and you get access to all kinds of interesting webinars and things, and you also get to know that you really are helping invertebrate conservation in Australia. We're doing a lot of hard work trying to get all of our programs up and running, and getting people on board with things like No Spray Spring and all kinds of exciting activities. So the more that we can be supported, the more we will be able to do. And we also have a couple of open positions at the moment. So we're looking for a membership officer. That's a volunteer position. And we'll soon be advertising for a bookkeeper, which will be a small casual paid position. So if you know of any people that that are interested in the cause and would like to help out, you could maybe send them our way. Thanks very much, everybody. We'll wrap up there, and a little survey will pop up on your browser when the webinar finishes to ask you what you thought. We're always really interested in people's feedback. It means a great deal to us, and we do look at all of it because we want to create an organization that does what you want in terms of invertebrate conservation, and make sure that we're looking after all of our supporters as well as all of the cutie crawlies.